Thanksgiving night. A table set with perfect precision, candles flickering against crystal glasses, the scent of roasted turkey still hanging in the air. 14 family members seated, waiting for the traditional toast. But David Hamilton wasn't standing to give thanks. He was standing to deliver humiliation. In his right hand, a thick manila envelope. In his left, a glass of 50-year-old scotch. His eyes moved across the table, landing on his wife of 23 years, Rebecca. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. At the far end of the table, a younger woman, Vanessa, 32 years old, smiled like she'd already won a prize she didn't know was cursed. David cleared his throat. The room went silent, and instead of gratitude, he delivered devastation. He slid the envelope across the polished oak table. It stopped right in front of Rebecca. "I think it's time we all stopped pretending," he said. "This marriage has been over for years." Gasps echoed. Forks dropped. His mother stood up, horrified. But Rebecca, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with the calm of someone who knew something he didn't. And that's when David made the biggest mistake of his life. He assumed her silence meant defeat. But what he didn't know was that Thanksgiving was about to turn into a funeral for his pride, his empire, and everything he thought he controlled. So why would a man choose Thanksgiving, of all days, to destroy his wife in front of their entire family? Why would he parade his mistress at the table like a trophy? And more importantly, why wasn't Rebecca breaking down? Most women would have screamed, cried, thrown the envelope back, but not her. She sat there like she was waiting for something, like she knew the punchline to a joke no one else had heard yet. And if you looked closely, really closely, you'd notice something else. A second envelope, smaller, resting on her lap, hidden under the table. David didn't see it. Vanessa didn't see it, but the camera caught it, and so did David's younger brother, sitting 2 seats down, whose face had gone pale. Because he knew what was coming. And as David raised his glass to toast his new beginning, Rebecca finally spoke. Just 4 words, quiet, steady, deadly. "Are you absolutely sure?" He laughed, a deep, arrogant laugh. "Oh, I'm sure, Rebecca, you have nothing." But in that moment, with those words, David Hamilton signed away everything he thought he owned, and he had no idea. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened that Thanksgiving night, you need to understand who Rebecca Hamilton used to be. 25 years ago, she wasn't a billionaire's wife. She was a law school graduate with a mind sharper than most judges. She'd been recruited by 3 top firms before she even finished her bar exam. Her professors called her relentless. Her classmates called her intimidating. But Rebecca didn't care about labels. She cared about justice, about precision, about building something that mattered. She came from a middle-class family in Ohio. Her father was a high school teacher. Her mother worked as a nurse. They didn't have money, but they had values. Work hard, stay humble. Never forget where you came from. Rebecca absorbed those lessons like oxygen. She worked 2 jobs to pay for law school, studied until 3 in the morning, graduated at the top of her class, and when the job offers came flooding in, she had her pick of the best firms in New York. But then she met David. It was at a networking event, one of those overly formal gatherings where everyone wore their ambition like cologne. David was there, pitching his startup idea to anyone who would listen. Most people ignored him, but Rebecca didn't. She listened, and she saw something in him, not just potential, but desperation. The kind of desperation that comes from knowing you're one failure away from giving up. They talked for 2 hours that night. He told her about his vision for a logistics company that would revolutionize supply chain management. She told him his business model had holes. He laughed. Most people would have been offended, but David was intrigued. "So, how would you fix it?" he asked. And Rebecca, without hesitation, laid out a strategy that would become the foundation of Hamilton Logistics. 3 months after they met, David and Rebecca started dating. 6 months later, they were engaged. And by the time they got married, Rebecca had already made her choice. She was going to help him build his dream. She told herself it was temporary, that once the company was stable, she'd go back to law. But months turned into years, and the temporary sacrifice became permanent. In the early days, they worked side by side. David handled the vision and the sales. Rebecca handled everything else: contracts, negotiations, hiring, firing, financial planning. She was the one who convinced their first major client to take a chance on them. She was the one who restructured their debt when they nearly went bankrupt in year 2. She was the one who stayed up all night preparing presentations while David slept, confident that everything would work out because Rebecca always made it work out. And for a while, it felt like partnership, like they were building something together. David would tell people, "I couldn't do this without her." He'd hold her hand at investor meetings. He'd thank her in front of employees. But slowly, as the company grew, something shifted. The more successful David became, the less he mentioned Rebecca's contributions. At first, it was small. He'd say "I" instead of "we" when talking about company milestones. Then he stopped bringing her to investor meetings. Then he started making major decisions without consulting her. And when Rebecca asked about it, he'd brush her off. "You've got the kids to worry about," he'd say. "Let me handle the business." It wasn't a conversation, it was a dismissal. And Rebecca, exhausted from raising 2 young children and still managing the company's legal affairs behind the scenes, let it go. She told herself it didn't matter, that as long as the family was stable, as long as the company was thriving, her ego could take the back seat. But what she didn't realize was that David wasn't just taking credit for her work. He was erasing her from the narrative entirely. By the time Hamilton Logistics hit a valuation of $800 million, Rebecca barely recognized the man she'd married. David had transformed into someone unrecognizable. The humble man who once thanked her for believing in him was gone. In his place was someone cold, dismissive, entitled. He started making jokes about her age at dinner parties, casual comments that cut deeper than he probably realized. Or maybe he did realize. Maybe that was the point. "Rebecca's from a different generation," he'd say with a laugh. "She doesn't really understand how modern business works." He'd introduce her as the wife instead of by name, as if 23 years of marriage had reduced her to a role instead of a person. And the worst part? People laughed along. They nodded. They agreed. Because David was rich now, powerful, and in that world, power redefines truth. Rebecca started to feel invisible in her own life. At company events, people would walk past her to talk to David. At family gatherings, conversations revolved around his success. And at home, David was barely there. He was always traveling, always in meetings, always too busy. And when he was home, he was distant, distracted, like he was tolerating her presence instead of enjoying it. Rebecca tried to talk to him about it once. It was late at night. The kids were asleep. She sat down next to him on the couch and said, "Do you still see me?" He looked up from his phone, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about us," she said. "When's the last time we had a real conversation? When's the last time you asked me how I'm doing?" David sighed. The kind of sigh that said he didn't have time for this. "Rebecca, I'm building an empire. I'm working 16-hour days. I don't have the energy for emotional check-ins." She stared at him. "I helped you build that empire. And I'm grateful," he said, his tone flat. "But that was years ago. Things are different now. Things are different now." Those words echoed in Rebecca's head for weeks. Because what he was really saying was, "You're not needed anymore." And maybe, deep down, she'd always known that was coming. But hearing it out loud was different. It made it real. And then came Vanessa. She was hired as a marketing consultant for a rebrand campaign. 23 years old, blonde, confident in a way that came from never having been tested by life. She walked into meetings like she owned the room. And David noticed. At first, Rebecca didn't think much of it. Vanessa was good at her job. The rebrand was successful. But then the late meetings started. Then the weekend, strategy sessions. Then the unexplained charges on the credit card. Hotels Rebecca never stayed at. Restaurants she'd never been to. Jewelry purchases that never made it home. Rebecca knew. Of course she knew. A wife always knows. But knowing and confronting are two different things. So, she watched. She paid attention. She noticed the way David's face lit up when Vanessa's name appeared on his phone. She noticed the new cologne, the new clothes, the sudden interest in going to the gym, and she noticed the way he stopped touching her, stopped looking at her, stopped pretending. One night, Rebecca found a bracelet in David's car, silver, delicate, with an inscription on the inside, "To New Beginnings, V." She sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, holding that bracelet, feeling the weight of her entire marriage collapse in her hands. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She put the bracelet back exactly where she found it, and she went inside, made dinner, helped Sarah with homework, kissed Ethan goodnight. And when David came home at 11, smelling like perfume that wasn't hers, she asked him how his day was. He barely looked at her. "Fine," he said, and that was it. But here's what people don't understand about betrayal. It's not always loud. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a bracelet in a glove compartment, a text message left open, a look that lasts too long. And sometimes the person being betrayed doesn't fall apart. They just start planning. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Rebecca had come home early from a charity meeting. The house was quiet. David's car was in the driveway, which was unusual. He was supposed to be at the office. She walked through the front door and heard his voice coming from his study. The door was cracked, and he was laughing. That deep, genuine laugh she hadn't heard in years. She stood in the hallway, frozen. "Yeah, Rebecca's fine," David was saying to whoever was on the phone. "She's got no skills, no career, nothing. If I divorce her, she'll take a settlement and disappear. It's not like she built anything. She just existed." Rebecca's breath caught. "Honestly," David continued, "I don't even know why I waited this long. I guess I felt guilty. But Vanessa's right. You can't build a future while dragging around the past." Silence. And then he laughed again. "No, she won't fight it. She's too passive, too comfortable. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her and move on." Rebecca stood there, listening to her husband erase 23 years like they were nothing, like she was nothing. She didn't storm in. She didn't confront him. She quietly walked back out the front door, got in her car, and drove. She didn't know where she was going. She just drove. For hours, until she ended up at a coffee shop in a town she didn't recognize. And that's when she made the call. To Alan Mercer, the lawyer who had helped David incorporate Hamilton Logistics back when it was just a dream and a pile of debt. Alan was retired now, living in Vermont. But when Rebecca called, he answered on the second ring. "Rebecca," he said, surprised. "It's been a long time." "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady. "And I need you to be honest with me." Of course, the incorporation documents from 2004, the ones David signed when the company was about to go under. "Do you still have copies?" There was a long pause. And then Alan said the words that would change everything. "I was wondering when you were going to ask me about those." 2 days later, Rebecca sat across from Alan in a quiet coffee shop in downtown Hartford. He slid a folder across the table, thick, old, with a law firm's embossed seal on the front. "I've kept these for 20 years, Alan said. "Just in case." Rebecca opened the folder. Inside were the original incorporation documents for Hamilton Logistics. She scanned the pages, her legal training kicking in automatically. And then she saw it. The ownership breakdown. Rebecca Hamilton, 72%. David Hamilton, 28%. She looked up at Alan, her heart pounding. "How is this possible?" Alan leaned back. "Do you remember that week, when David was 3 months from losing everything?" Rebecca nodded. He'd maxed out every credit card, borrowed from friends, burned through every investor he could find. The company was drowning. "And you were 8 months pregnant with Sarah," Alan continued. "You'd taken out a second mortgage on your parents' house to keep the business afloat. You were exhausted, stressed, and David was panicking." Rebecca remembered. Those were the darkest months of their marriage. David had been on the verge of a breakdown, and Rebecca had been holding everything together with sheer willpower. "David came to me," Alan said, "and asked me to restructure the company. He wanted to make it look more attractive to potential investors, so I drafted new incorporation documents. And I made a choice." He paused. "I made you the majority owner." Rebecca stared at him. "Why?" "Because I saw what you were doing for him," Alan said. "I saw how much you were sacrificing, and I saw how reckless he was. I knew that if the company ever succeeded, David would become the kind of man who forgets the people who built him. So I protected you. Legally. But I signed those documents, Rebecca said. I remember signing. You did, Alan confirmed. But you were exhausted, pregnant, overwhelmed. You didn't read them. You just signed where I told you to. And David, Alan smiled. David didn't read them either. He just wanted it done. He trusted me. And he trusted you. Rebecca sat back, her mind racing. So for 20 years, I've owned the majority of Hamilton Logistics, and neither of us knew? You didn't know, Alan corrected. I knew, and I've been waiting for the day you'd need this information. Rebecca looked down at the documents again. 72%. Everything David thought he'd built. Everything he thought he owned. It was hers. Legally, irrevocably. Hers. Rebecca didn't rush. She didn't act impulsively. She did what she'd always done. She planned. Over the next year, she quietly built her case. She hired a forensic accountant, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. Patricia was ruthless, methodical, and she didn't ask questions. She just followed the money. What she found was damning. David had been hiding assets for years, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies registered in Delaware, money funneled through fake consulting firms. But it wasn't just hidden wealth. It was fraud. David had been inflating company revenues to attract investors, falsifying financial reports, covering losses with borrowed money that was never paid back. He'd been lying to the board, lying to shareholders, lying to everyone. And the affair with Vanessa? That was the least of his crimes. Patricia discovered that David had been paying Vanessa over $400,000 over the past 18 months, not through his personal accounts, through company funds, which meant he was embezzling from a company he didn't actually own, because Rebecca owned it. Rebecca also started documenting everything. Every late night David claimed to be working, every lie about business trips, every expense that didn't add up. She created a timeline, a paper trail, evidence that would hold up in any court. And she did it all while smiling at family dinners, while hosting charity events, while pretending everything was fine. Because Rebecca had learned something over the past 23 years. She'd learned that the most dangerous woman in the room is the one everyone underestimates. 6 months before Thanksgiving, Rebecca met with her legal team. 3 lawyers, all women, all specialists in family law, corporate law, and white-collar crime. They laid out her options. She could file for divorce quietly, take her 72% and walk away. She'd be set for life, or she could go public, expose David's fraud, let the authorities handle it. But Rebecca didn't want either of those options. I want him to destroy himself, she said. The lawyers exchanged glances. What do you mean? One of them asked. I mean, I want him to think he's won, Rebecca said. I want him to feel powerful, untouchable, and then I want him to realize he never had any power at all. She leaned forward. He's planning to divorce me. I know he is. He's just waiting for the right moment. So let him. Let him file. Let him humiliate me in front of everyone. And then I'll show him the truth. Her lead attorney, a woman named Margaret Torres, smiled. You want to let him hang himself? Exactly. And when do you want to do this? Rebecca thought for a moment, and then she said the one word that would define everything. Thanksgiving. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Why Thanksgiving? Because that's when he'll feel the most confident, Rebecca said. Surrounded by family, playing the role of the generous patriarch. He'll think he's in control, and that's when I'll take it all away from him. The plan was set. Rebecca would wait. She'd let David make his move, and when he did, she'd be ready, not with anger, not with tears, but with the cold, undeniable truth. The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were tense. David was acting strange, secretive. He'd taken 3 phone calls in the past month that he didn't want Rebecca to hear. He'd met with his lawyer twice, and Vanessa had been coming to the house more often. For meetings. Rebecca played her part perfectly. She planned the Thanksgiving menu, sent out invitations, ordered flowers. She acted like the dutiful wife, the woman who didn't know her marriage was ending, but inside she was counting down. One night, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, David came home late. Rebecca was in the kitchen, making tea. He walked in, loosened his tie, and poured himself a drink. "We need to talk," he said. Rebecca's heart raced, but her face stayed calm. "About what?" "About us." He sat down at the kitchen table. "I think we both know this isn't working anymore." Rebecca sat across from him. "What isn't working?" "This," he said, gesturing between them. "The marriage. We've grown apart, Rebecca. We want different things." "What do you want?" she asked. David hesitated, and then he said it. "I want a divorce." Rebecca let the words hang in the air. She took a sip of her tea, and then she looked at him. "When?" "After the holidays," David said. "I don't want to ruin Thanksgiving for the kids." Rebecca almost laughed. He was going to ruin Thanksgiving, just not in the way he thought. "Okay," she said simply. David looked surprised. "Okay?" "Yes," Rebecca said. "If that's what you want, then okay." He stared at her, clearly expecting more. A fight, tears, something. But Rebecca just stood up, rinsed her cup, and walked upstairs, leaving him sitting there, confused. Because the thing about Rebecca, she'd stopped fighting for a man who didn't see her worth. She'd started fighting for herself. Thanksgiving morning. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted herbs. Rebecca had been up since 5, preparing. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, pies, everything perfect. The guests started arriving around noon. David's mother, Helen, a woman who'd always treated Rebecca like a daughter. David's 2 brothers, Daniel and Christopher, with their wives and kids. Rebecca's younger sister, Michelle, who flew in from Seattle. And the kids, Ethan, 20, home from college. Sarah, 17, who'd been quiet lately, distant, like she knew something was wrong. Vanessa arrived at 1. David introduced her as a colleague. No one believed it. The tension in the room was suffocating. Helen pulled Rebecca aside in the kitchen. "Why is she here?" she asked, her voice low. Rebecca smiled. David invited her. "Rebecca, you don't have to put up with this." "I know," Rebecca said, and something in her tone made Helen stop, made her look at Rebecca differently, like she was seeing her for the first time in years. Dinner was served at 3. Everyone took their seats. David at the head of the table, Rebecca at the other end. Vanessa off to the side, smiling like she belonged there. The meal was quiet, awkward. People made small talk, but no one was really eating. And then, just as dessert was being brought out, David stood up. He cleared his throat. The room went silent, and Rebecca knew. This was it. David held up his glass. Everyone thought he was about to make a toast, but instead he pulled out an envelope, thick, official-looking, and he slid it across the table to Rebecca. "I think it's time we all stopped pretending," he said. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "This marriage has been over for years. Rebecca and I have grown apart. We want different things, and I think it's best if we're honest about that." Gasps, forks, clattering. Helen stood up, her face red with anger. "David, what are you doing?" He ignored her. His eyes stayed locked on Rebecca. "You've been a good mother," he continued. "But let's be honest. We've both changed. I've built an empire, and you've been comfortable living in it. But I need a partner who understands the world I'm in now." Vanessa smiled. Ethan pushed his chair back so hard it tipped over. "Dad, are you serious right now?" David didn't even glance at his son. "I'm filing for divorce, Rebecca. The papers are in the envelope. You'll be taken care of financially. You'll have enough to live comfortably. But it's time we both moved on." The room was frozen, everyone staring, waiting for Rebecca to break, to cry, to scream. But she didn't. She just sat there, looking at the envelope. And then, slowly, she smiled. Not a sad smile, not a broken one, a knowing smile. "Are you absolutely sure this is what you want?" she asked. David scoffed. "Yes, Rebecca, I'm sure. You have nothing. No career. No income. You'll be fine with the settlement, but let's not pretend you built this." "I did." And that's when Rebecca reached under the table. She pulled out her own envelope, older, thicker, with a law firm's embossed seal that David recognized. She placed it on the table. "What's that?" David asked, his confidence flickering for the first time. Rebecca folded her hands. "That's the truth." David stared at the envelope. His brother Daniel, sitting 2 seats down, had gone pale. Because Daniel was the CFO, he knew what old legal documents meant. "Rebecca, don't," Daniel whispered. But she wasn't stopping. "This Rebecca said, tapping the envelope, is the incorporation paperwork from 2004. The documents you signed when Hamilton Logistics was 3 months from bankruptcy. Do you remember that time, David? His jaw tightened. Of course I remember. Do you remember who saved you? His silence was answer enough. I took out a second mortgage on my parents' house, Rebecca continued. I gave you every dollar I had. I worked 18-hour days while you panicked, and when you were ready to give up, I'm the one who told you to keep going. She opened the envelope. And Alan Mercer, the lawyer you trusted, the one who prepared these documents, made sure that if you ever forgot what I did for you, there'd be a legal record. She pulled out the papers and slid them across to David. Read it. David grabbed the documents, his hands shaking. His eyes scanned the pages, and then he saw it. The ownership structure. Rebecca Hamilton, 72%. David Hamilton, 28%. The color drained from his face. This can't be real. It's real, Rebecca said calmly. It's been filed with the state for 20 years. It's been sitting in corporate records this entire time. You just never bothered to check. Vanessa leaned over, trying to read. Her smile vanished. You're telling me, David said, his voice breaking, that I don't own my own company? You own 28%, Rebecca said, which, as of today's valuation, is worth about $220 million. Congratulations, David. You're still very, very rich. She paused. But the buildings? Mine. The contracts? Mine. The board seats? Mine. The patents? Mine. Everything you've been bragging about for the past 10 years? It's all mine, legally, irrevocably, mine. The room was dead silent. Helen was crying. Ethan was staring at his father like he'd never seen him before. And David looked like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse. But Rebecca wasn't done. She reached into her purse and pulled out a second folder, thinner, but somehow more dangerous. She slid it to David. What's this? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. That's the evidence of your financial fraud, Rebecca said. Offshore accounts, shell companies, falsified revenue reports. You've been lying to investors for years, David, covering losses with borrowed money, inflating valuations. She leaned forward. And the payments to Vanessa? $400,000 over 18 months, pulled from company funds. That's embezzlement. From a company I own. David's hands were trembling. You can't do this. I'm not doing anything, Rebecca said. You did this. You chose to lie. You chose to cheat. You chose to break the law. I'm just holding up a mirror. She looked at Vanessa. You should leave. He's broke. Or he will be once the board votes to remove him, which they will. Because I control the board. Vanessa grabbed her purse and walked out without a word. No goodbye. No apology. Just gone. Rebecca turned back to David. I gave you everything. I built you. I believed in you when no one else did. And you repaid me by trying to erase me, by telling people I contributed nothing, by bringing your mistress to my table. She stood up. But here's the truth, David. You were never self-made. You were Rebecca-made. You just forgot. Ethan stood up and walked to his mother's side. So did Sarah. So did Michelle. And one by one, the rest of the family followed, until David was left standing at the head of the table, alone, holding documents that proved he'd lost everything, not because Rebecca destroyed him, but because he destroyed himself, and she'd simply stopped protecting him from the consequences. The days after Thanksgiving were chaos. David hired a team of lawyers. They reviewed the incorporation documents. They searched for loopholes. They tried everything, but there was nothing they could do. The documents were legal, filed, binding. Rebecca owned 72% of Hamilton Logistics, and there was no reversing it. The board called an emergency meeting. Daniel, as CFO, had to present the financial evidence Rebecca had provided. The offshore accounts, the falsified reports, the embezzlement. One by one, the board members reviewed the evidence. And one by one, they realized that David had been lying to them for years. The vote was unanimous. David Hamilton was removed as CEO. He kept his 28% stake, but he had no power, no control, no voice. And the IRS? They came knocking 3 weeks later. Audits, investigations, subpoenas. David settled quietly, paid millions in fines and back taxes, and his reputation destroyed. Business magazines that had once called him a visionary now called him a cautionary tale. Vanessa, as expected, disappeared. She blocked his number, deleted her social media, moved to Los Angeles and started dating a venture capitalist. She'd never loved David. She'd loved what she thought he had. And the moment that was gone, so was she. David moved out of the estate, into a downtown apartment. Nice, by normal standards, but nothing compared to what he'd had. And every night, he sat alone, trying to figure out how it had all gone so wrong, how the woman he'd underestimated had outmaneuvered him completely. Rebecca, on the other hand, stepped into her new role with grace. She became the CEO of Hamilton Logistics, not because she wanted revenge, but because she'd earned it. The company didn't just survive under her leadership, it thrived. She cleaned up the financial mess David had created, restored investor confidence, paid back every dollar that had been misappropriated, and she transformed the company's culture. No more cutthroat competition, no more toxic masculinity. She built a company based on integrity, transparency, respect. Within a year, Hamilton Logistics grew by 30%. Within 2 years, it was valued at over $1 billion. And Rebecca? She became one of the most respected CEOs in the industry. Ethan joined the company after graduating. He worked in operations, learning the business from the ground up. Sarah started a non-profit focused on helping women escape financial abuse, using part of the family wealth to fund shelters, legal aid, and education programs. And Rebecca herself? She finally lived the life she'd put on hold. She traveled, wrote a book about resilience and reinvention, spoke at universities and conferences, and every Thanksgiving she hosted dinner. But David was never invited. The family had made their choice, and they'd chosen Rebecca. One journalist asked her, 3 years after the divorce, what she would say to women in similar situations. Rebecca thought for a moment. I'd say this: your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to see it. You are not responsible for making someone respect you. You're only responsible for respecting yourself enough to walk away when they don't. She paused. And if you helped build something, make sure your name is on it, legally, irrevocably, because people forget. But paperwork doesn't. So, here's what I want you to think about. What would you have done in Rebecca's position? Would you have confronted David the moment you found out about the affair? Would you have filed for divorce quietly and taken your share? Or would you have done what Rebecca did? Waited, planned, let him think he'd won, and then revealed the truth at the moment it would hurt the most. Some people might say Rebecca was cold, calculating, that she should have forgiven him, given him another chance. But here's the thing. Rebecca gave David 23 years of chances, 23 years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of building him up when he was ready to give up, and David repaid her by trying to erase her, by telling the world she'd contributed nothing, by humiliating her in front of their family. So, the question isn't whether Rebecca was too harsh. The question is, how long should someone tolerate being erased? And here's another question. Do you think David ever truly understood what he lost? Or do you think, even now, he's sitting in that apartment, blaming Rebecca for his downfall, blaming her for tricking him, for hiding the ownership documents, instead of recognizing that he destroyed himself, that his arrogance, his cruelty, his belief that he was untouchable, that's what brought him down? Because here's the truth about people like David. They never think they're the problem. They always think they're the victim, and that's why they lose. Not because someone destroyed them, but because they never learned to value the people who built them. So, if you're watching this, and you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or underestimated, remember Rebecca's story. Remember that silence isn't weakness, patience isn't passivity, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop protecting someone from the consequences of their own choices. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what you thought of Rebecca's choice. Because your voice matters, and I can't wait to hear it. Until next time, remember this: never underestimate the person who built you. Because the foundation they laid, they can take it back whenever they choose, and when they do, you'll realize you were never standing on solid ground. You were standing on their grace, and grace, once withdrawn, leaves nothing but the fall.